the silence before the storm. No, I was not alive in 1939, but I have walked through the ruins that war left behind. I have stood in the empty shells of buildings once filled with laughter, stared at the faded photographs of families who vanished, and touched the cold stones of memorials built for the nameless dead. Silence in such places is not peace. It is heavy, suffocating, and filled with echoes. It is the same kind of silence that blanketed the world after the First World War, when everyone prayed such horror would never return, even as the seeds of the next catastrophe were already being planted. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 was supposed to end all wars. That is what politicians promised. That is what grieving parents wanted to believe as they buried their sons beneath rows of white crosses. 16 million dead, 20 million wounded, and entire towns stripped of their youth. The horror was so vast that writers struggled to describe it. Artists painted only in grief, and leaders swore humanity had learned its lesson. Yet history, as I have learned, rarely obeys human promises. Within just 2 decades, the world would plunge once more into fire. The guns would roar louder, the bombs would fall harder, and the destruction would reach every corner of the globe. How could humanity stumble so quickly from peace to catastrophe? Was it fate, or was it the result of choices made by desperate societies, reckless leaders, and flawed compromises? As a novelist and a psychologist who has studied war, I believe their answer is not simple. War is never born from one decision. It grows from humiliation and hunger, from fear, from pride. It grows when leaders turn the pain of the people into weapons, and when the world chooses silence instead of resistance. World War II did not begin suddenly in September 1939, when German tanks crossed into Poland. It began earlier, in the ashes of Versailles, in the despair of the Great Depression, and in the rise of fascism that promised salvation through violence. To understand why the world burned again, we must go back to those years of fragile peace, when the silence before the storm deceived so many into believing that the danger had passed. This is not just history, it is a warning. Peace is never guaranteed. Silence is not safety. And when the world refuses to confront injustice, war waits patiently at the door. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was intended to secure peace. Instead, it became a document of humiliation. The choice of venue was deliberate. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, where in 1871, Germany had proclaimed its empire after defeating France. Now, Germany was forced to kneel in the same hall, stripped of dignity. For the Allies, this was justice. For the Germans, it was revenge, disguised as law. The terms were harsh. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, and the Polish corridor split East Prussia from the rest of the nation. The Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations control, its coal exploited by France. The Rhineland was demilitarized, leaving Germany exposed. Overseas colonies were seized by Britain, France, and Japan. The army was cut to 100,000 men, the navy reduced to a handful of ships, and an AIR force forbidden entirely. For a society proud of its military tradition, this was a national insult. Worst of all was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war, and pay reparations so massive they seemed impossible to meet. To ordinary Germans, this was collective shame, branding every man, woman, and child guilty for a conflict they believed had many fathers. The effects of Versailles were not abstract. They were felt in kitchens, in factories, and in the streets. By the early 1920s, hyperinflation turned wages into worthless paper. Prices doubled in hours. Families carried banknotes in baskets, only to find they could not buy bread by evening. Children made toys out of currency. Bakers demanded wheelbarrows of bills for a single loaf. Entire classes lost their savings overnight. For millions, Versailles was not history. It was hunger. Psychological wounds cut deeper still. Veterans returned from the trenches to find their medals mocked, their sacrifices dismissed as futile. Families mourning sons were told they had fought for nothing. National pride curdled into bitterness. From this bitterness grew the myth of the stab in the back, the belief that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but betrayed by traitors at home, politicians, communists, Jews. It was a poisonous lie, but one that spread easily because it offered a target for pain. In Munich beer halls, a failed artist and embittered soldier named Adolf Hitler found his audience. He raged against Versailles, promising to tear it apart and restore German greatness. For those humiliated and hungry, his words burned like fire. Versailles was meant to close a chapter, but it opened a wound that never healed, a wound that would bleed into the next war. The fragile peace of the 1920s offered a false sense of stability. In Germany, the Weimar Republic stabilized its currency, and with the help of American loans, factories reopened, theaters filled, and new art movements thrived. For a moment, it seemed the nation could live with the humiliation of Versailles. But in October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. What began as a financial panic in the United States swept across the globe like a storm. Banks toppled, credit dried up, and world trade shrank to 1/3 of its former size. Germany, dependent on American loans, was hit the hardest. By 1932, over 6 million Germans, nearly 1 in 3 workers, were unemployed. Entire towns sank into despair. In Britain, industrial regions like the coal mining valleys of Wales stood silent, their smokestacks cold. In America, the Dust Bowl turned fertile farmland into wasteland, driving thousands of families into desperate migration. Even in France, which had seemed more stable, strikes and protests revealed cracks in the system. Hunger and uncertainty poisoned everyday life. Families queued for bread, children wore shoes with holes, and parents pawned wedding rings for fuel. Democracy's lofty ideals, liberty, compromise, debate, meant little when people were cold and starving. And in such despair, extremism thrived. People turned from debate to demagogues, from compromise to certainty. Radical movements promised quick answers, blaming scapegoats, and promising salvation. It was in this climate that fascism found fertile ground, reshaping the politics of nations desperate to survive. In Germany, men in brown shirts marched through the streets, offering a sense of belonging. In Italy, Mussolini's regime pointed to the failures of democracy and boasted of action. In Japan, military officers warned that only expansion could rescue the nation from economic crisis. Around the world, Hardship made people willing to trade freedom for order, rights for bread, uncertainty for certainty. What began as an economic collapse soon became a political earthquake. Governments faltered, coalitions fractured, and parliaments filled with shouting. Instead of solutions, the hunger for stability pushed millions toward leaders who promised not patience, but power. And for those leaders, the Depression was a gift. It gave them not only desperate audiences, but also a moral shield. When the people are starving, who dares argue against strong action? The Great Depression was more than numbers on stock tickers. It was despair that seeped into homes, into politics, into every decision. Out of that despair, ideologies once dismissed as extreme became the mainstream path to survival. Fascism was not born in a single country, nor did it arise overnight. It was a response to humiliation, poverty, and fear, a creed that promised strength where democracy seemed weak. In Italy, Benito Mussolini, once a socialist journalist, reinvented himself as a man of action. He gathered squads of black shirts, men who marched through the streets with truncheons and slogans, silencing opponents with fists and fire. By 1922, Mussolini had seized power, boasting that he would revive the glory of the Roman Empire. For many Italians, weary of economic chaos and political paralysis, his call for order sounded like salvation. In Germany, the seeds of fascism sprouted in the bitterness left by Versailles and the Great Depression. Adolf Hitler transformed the small, obscure National Socialist German Workers' Party into a mass movement. He understood the power of spectacle, rallies filled with flags, drums and torchlight, made individuals feel part of something larger than themselves. Hitler's speeches blended rage and hope, promising revenge against enemies and rebirth for the nation. For millions of Germans who felt betrayed and broken, this vision was irresistible. Fascism thrived on myths of racial superiority, of betrayal by hidden traitors, of a destiny stolen by outsiders. It told people they were chosen, that their suffering was not meaningless, but a sign they were meant for greatness. Such illusions, repeated often enough, became truths in the minds of desperate citizens. Japan, too, fell under the sway of militarist ideology. Though the emperor remained a sacred figure, real power shifted to generals and admirals who claimed divine destiny for their nation. They preached that Japan must dominate Asia, not merely to survive, but to fulfill its role as leader of a new order. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was a bold declaration. Japan would seize what it needed, regardless of international condemnation. What united fascist movements across Italy, Germany, and Japan was their psychology. They rejected compromise as weakness, glorified violence as proof of strength, and treated dissent as treason. Freedom of speech vanished. Opposition parties were crushed. Children were taught loyalty before they learned arithmetic. Propaganda saturated daily life. Posters, films, radio broadcasts, all hammering the message that the nation was sacred and the leader infallible. For the people, this offered a dangerous comfort. In a world of chaos and uncertainty, fascism provided certainty. It told them who to blame: foreigners, minorities, communists, Jews, and gave them a story in which they were the heroes. To those suffering from hunger and shame, belonging to a great cause felt better than standing alone in despair. Yet beneath the parades and speeches lay rot. Fascism promised glory, but its true face was violence, oppression, and war. By the late 1930s, these regimes stood armed and unyielding, ready to test their vision of greatness against the world. The stage was set for catastrophe on a scale humanity had never witnessed before. By the mid-1930s, fascist powers were testing the boundaries of international order. Hitler rearmed Germany in open defiance of Versailles. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, a direct violation of the treaty. France and Britain, though fully aware of the breach, did nothing. Many citizens cheered their government's restraint, insisting that peace was worth any price. Yet the silence of the democracies was interpreted by Hitler as weakness. The fear of another great war haunted Britain and France. Both nations had lost millions between 1914 and 1918. Their economies still staggered under debt, and their populations had little appetite for another conflict. So when Hitler pushed, they stepped back. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League of Nations condemned the act, but imposed only weak sanctions. The Italian dictator mocked the response, declaring that empires were not built with words. Appeasement was not merely a strategy, it was a symptom of exhaustion. Leaders like Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that concessions could satisfy dictators. They imagined that Hitler's demands were finite, that if given Austria or parts of Czechoslovakia, he would be content. But appeasement misunderstood the very nature of fascism. It was not fueled by limited goals. It was fueled by ambition, without end. The crisis reached its peak in 1938 with Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a large ethnic German population. The Czechs prepared to resist, counting on their alliances with France and Britain. Yet at the Munich conference, Chamberlain and French leaders agreed to Hitler's terms without consulting Prague. They handed over the Sudetenland in the name of peace, but in giving away land, they also gave away trust. When Chamberlain returned to London, he waved a piece of paper and proclaimed he had secured peace for our time. Crowds applauded, desperate to believe him. But Winston Churchill, then a voice in the political wilderness, warned, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." His words would prove prophetic. Hitler saw appeasement as proof that the West lacked courage. Far from being satisfied, he accelerated his plans. By March 1939, German troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, seizing Prague without firing a shot. The promise that appeasement would preserve peace lay in ruins. Appeasement was not peace, it was delay. By yielding to aggression, Britain and France did not avoid war, they guaranteed it. Fascist leaders learned that intimidation worked, that threats brought rewards, and so the path to conflict grew shorter. The illusion of safety vanished, and the world braced for the inevitable. By 1939, Europe stood on the brink. Hitler had already dismantled Versailles, piece by piece. Austria was annexed in the Anschluss of 1938. Czechoslovakia was dismembered, first through Munich, then completely absorbed in March 1939. Germany stood stronger, bolder, and more determined. Yet Hitler's gaze now turned to Poland, the nation created by Versailles, and sitting astride the territory he long coveted. To him, Poland represented not only land and resources, but the first step toward the grand vision of Lebensraum, living space in the East. Poland, however, was different. From Austria or Czechoslovakia, Britain and France, alarmed at Hitler's expansion, guaranteed Poland's independence. If Germany struck, they promised to respond. For Hitler, this was a dangerous obstacle, but then came a startling solution: partnership with Stalin. In August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shocked the world. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn enemies, announced a non-aggression agreement. Beneath its public promises lay secret clauses dividing Eastern Europe. Poland would be split. The Baltic states would fall to the Soviets. For weeks, Europe held its breath. Diplomats scrambled, but no negotiation could stop the tide. Hitler had made his choice, and the world could only watch as the storm gathered on Poland's border. This cynical bargain gave both dictators what they wanted. Stalin gained time to prepare his army. Hitler secured his eastern flank. No longer fearing a two-front war, Hitler readied his generals. With the pact signed, the last barrier was removed. The countdown to invasion had begun. At dawn, on September 1st, 1939, German planes darkened the Polish sky. Bombs fell on railroads, bridges, and cities. Tanks thundered forward in blitzkrieg. Lightning war, a terrifying combination of speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Within weeks, Polish resistance was broken. Then, on September 17th, Soviet armies crossed from the east. Poland was carved apart, its people trapped between two merciless giants. For Britain and France, this was the breaking point. On September 3rd, both declared war on Germany. Crowds gathered in London and Paris, listening to radios. Intense silence, as their leaders announced what everyone had dreaded: the world was again at war. Yet even then, Allied armies remained hesitant. The so-called phony warmong saw soldiers waiting behind the Maginot Line, while Poland was consumed. Their inaction would later prove disastrous, but the illusion of peace was gone. The descent from Versailles to invasion had taken 2 decades. The humiliation of defeat, the despair of depression, the rise of fascism, and the failures of appeasement had all converged. The invasion of Poland was not an isolated event. It was the inevitable climax of choices left unchecked. The Second World War did not begin by accident. It began because aggression was rewarded, warnings were ignored, and silence replaced action. The invasion of Poland shattered the illusion of peace and ignited a conflict that would consume continents. What began as the final step to secure German dominance became the spark of a war that would outgrow even Hitler's control. The storm had broken, and the world was plunged into its darkest chapter. The road to World War II was not a sudden collapse, but a long descent. Versailles humiliated Germany. The Depression starved millions,